great. So thanks very much to Mike and the committee for inviting us to come along and speak. I think it's probably been a wee while actually since we were speaking about the feasibility project. So it's really great to be along this morning. What we're really going to do is kind of, I guess, take you through the journey that the steering group has been on the past, I guess, three and a bit years in terms of the feasibility study for a basic income pilot in Scotland. So what we're going to do is give a bit of a background and timeline to the project, an overview of why it was important to have a strong rationale for a pilot, the design, pilot aims and model that we were recommending, and also look at a summary of the feasibility assessment that we carried out and the recommendations of the final report, and then have a bit of a brief chat about where we are just now in Scotland. Okay, so we commenced the feasibility study back in August 2018, although there was a bit of a history in a run up into that with various organisations in Scotland, including a number of local authorities, exploring the concept of basic income and what it might do for the people in Scotland. In our final report, we did recommend that a robust and well-designed pilot would be undertaken in Scotland and provide an invaluable opportunity to test and evaluate the effects of CBI within the Scottish context. And that is the recommendation of the steering group. However, there are currently no plans to conduct a pilot in Scotland at this time, and we can get into some of the reasons for that as we go through. So back in May 2018, the Scottish Government did confirm £250,000 to support the feasibility study, and that was backed by resources from all of the organisations that you can see on the screen. The final report was published last June, and this really presents our findings into the feasibility of a pilot. And at that point, I'd like to just hand over to Vary, who's going to take you through some of the timeline and the recommendations in terms of our pilot.
Thanks, Wendy. Okay, so in terms of our project timeline, following the allocation of the Scottish Government funding and similar support from local authorities involved, we started formal work on the feasibility study in August 2018. So within that first year to 18 months, what we did was we were looking at evidence across published research. We started defining our outcomes and objectives as well. And we actually attended the BN conference in Finland in August 2018. So that was really helpful in learning from contemporary pilots at the time. And we actually published an international learning report with the Carnegie UK Trust on our experiences there, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. So we engaged with the local community as well in terms of their perceptions on basic income as well, and we looked at national and international surveys of public attitudes. We also started to engage with stakeholders in Scotland as well, and we commissioned research on potential interaction of basic income with existing UK social security arrangements, and that was conducted by the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland as well, and was very helpful in the later stages of the work. So in the sort of second phase, from November 2019 to spring 2020, we engaged with other organisations, including the Department for Work and Pensions and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs as well, which was absolutely crucial for understanding the institutional arrangements that would be required to run a basic income pilot in Scotland. We also commissioned research on economic modelling of a Scotland-wide CBI policy. So this was undertaken by Fraser Ballender Institute at the University of Strathclyde and their partners, which included the Institute for Public Policy Research and Manchester Metropolitan University. So that was completed in June 2020. We also looked at finalising our pilot model options and evaluation strategy and assessing the overall feasibility of that pilot model as well. And we published an interim feasibility report in November 2019 as well. And the final stage of our work, we completed the economic modelling that we commissioned. As I said, that was completed in June 2020. And we were also preparing the final feasibility report and engaging with our stakeholder and councillor groups at the time as well. So as Wendy said, published the final report in June last year. Next slide, please, Wendy. Great, thank you. So as I touched on before, we actually attended the previous Congress in Finland in 2018, which seems like a long time ago now. And that was really helpful for us to explore the lessons that could be learned from the other activity that was underway in countries that were potentially similar to Scotland. And we could use that to compare the work that we're doing ourselves. So we engaged with colleagues internationally that were working on developing these pilots and these experiments. And we were looking particularly at Finland, the Netherlands, and Ontario in Canada, who were undertaking experiments or about to undertake experiments at that time. So we really focused on our learning and the practical lessons that we could take from this. So we looked at how experiments were framed, how they were designed, implemented, evaluated, and the communication that surrounded those as well. So these lessons absolutely proved invaluable to us as we progressed through the feasibility study. And like I said, we worked with the Carnegie UK Trust to publish this report on our lessons from BN. So, and that's available on the Carnegie UK Trust website, and we'll share a link to those that resource at the end of this presentation as well. Next slide, please, Wendy. Great, thank you. So I guess in a way we've kind of come full circle from our attendance at BN in 2018 to here in 2021. But in terms of looking at the more practical aspects of the work that we undertook, at the very kind of initial stages, we knew it was clear that we had to have a clear rationale for making a policy argument and a clear rationale for why we wanted to pilot a citizens' basic income in Scotland. We knew that CBI was having a recent rapid growth in public and political interest. It was being focused on in terms of alleviating poverty, improving income inequality, and reducing work disincentives. However, there were still some questions around the uncertainty of how it would actually work in Scotland. And this is something that we wanted to test further. There was a lot of uncertainties around how it would work in our current tax and benefits situations, our social security arrangements, and we wanted to know more about how that would fit, particularly being a pilot rather than a full-scale policy. We also knew that broad-scale political support for basic income policy is crucial. And with these various unknowns, it was really important to gain further insight and evidence for how a basic income would work, and then so gain that political support if so required for a broad-scale policy. So in terms of where we were at the outset of thinking about a pilot and whether there were any alternatives, we considered whether it would be appropriate to move straight to policy implementation. But again, for some of the reasons I've just outlined, we figured this was too risky. We needed to test the implementation, and we needed more evidence in a Scottish context. We also considered economic modelling only, but we considered this to be providing incomplete information about a broad range of impacts, so individual impacts and community scale impacts of a basic income as well, which we were interested in and believed there was a bit of a gap in that evidence there as well. So it's really important. It was really important for us at the start to make sure that we absolutely knew why we were piloting a basic income and what we were trying to get out of it as well. Wendy, if you want to move on to the next slide, please. So this is where it brought us on to our pilot aims and objectives. And really importantly, as I'm sure you all appreciate here, given your interest in basic income, we wanted to design and test a pilot that addressed all the fundamental principles of a basic income. So universal, unconditional, individual, regular payments, and a cash equivalent. And we knew that it had to be designed to work along the current social security system within a pilot context as well. In terms of understanding what the basic income would have an impact on, we had to work through what would be our primary outcomes. So we considered our primary outcomes to be on poverty, child poverty, unemployment, health and financial well-being, and experience of the social security system in the context of running a basic income pilot as well. This was really important to determine how we would then evaluate the outcomes of that as well, and ensure that it was robust and systematic. So we undertook an evaluability assessment to determine that as well. We were also interested in other outcomes, so secondary outcomes of community effects and social economic outcomes. And in order to do that, we would have to look at a community level basic income, and we were interested in outcomes such as volunteering, informal caring networks, the establishment of new social enterprises, etc. As well. So in terms of what a robust pilot could deliver, we wanted to see what the impact would be on behaviour in a Scottish context, the community level outcomes, like I said. It would also allow us to test the design and the implementation features, and making sure that the practical arrangements would allow an accurate CBI to be tested. And it would also stimulate policy debate on basic income as well. Hopefully, if it, achieving the desired outcomes, it would provide support to explore further. Wendy, next slide, please. So, in moving on to the pilot design recommendations that we have posed in our final report. Like I said, we were really keen that a pilot would meet the key basic income principles. And we saw great value in this because at the time that we were undertaking the work, there was currently no experiment that was addressing all of the principles. And we set out to test a basic income and not just elements of it. So that was a really key feature for us. And as Wendy will come on to explain in later slides, that did present challenges for us in terms of institutional arrangements for a pilot. However, that's what we think it would be valuable to test and see all the aspects of basic income. We also decided to test two different levels of basic income value, and this was to understand the different effects that these two levels may have. So we had proposed a low level basic income, so you'll see that there in the table there, and this was closely aligned to what current benefit levels were at the time we did the feasibility. And then there was also a high level CBI, which was based on the minimum income standard as proposed by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as well. So you'll see that there's a much higher level, and that was in order to test the differences that might come alongside receiving different levels of basic income. We also wanted to make sure that the pilot was delivered for a substantial amount of time, that it would allow some of the short and medium term outcomes to start to filter through. And this was also where our learning from other pilots and experiments underway helped us decide on 3 years was perhaps sufficient a time for short and medium term outcomes to come through. But we also thought it was really important to have a 1 year additional preparatory period before the pilot would start, in order to ease people into that transition, provide them with the support that they required, and make sure that on day one of our 3 years of the pilot, it would be up and running and undertaken the way as expected, and would be able to have a robust evaluation at the end of the 3 years. Crucially, we didn't want to pilot a basic income which would lead to financial or otherwise detriment for some groups of population. And this is why we commissioned research by the Child Poverty Action Group to support how a basic income would work alongside the current social security arrangements in Scotland. And that commissioned research identified that certain entitlements would need to continue alongside basic income to avoid a financial detriment. So in terms of accurately evaluating a basic income as well, and not getting confused around the existing social security arrangements, we proposed that some existing income related benefits were suspended. However, as I said, to avoid financial detriment to some groups of people with particular requirements, we would need some benefits to remain, so namely disability, housing, childcare, and those aligned to limited capability for work as well. There's much more detail on this and the intricacies of this in our feasibility report if you're interested on this further. Next slide, please, Wendy. So just continuing on with the design recommendations that we proposed. We said it would be a randomised control study. And because we were interested in 2 levels of a basic income, this would take place in 2 study areas where the whole community in each of those study areas would receive a basic income. So it was a saturation experiment. So one group would receive the high payment and the other would receive the low payment. And would obviously have a control group alongside that as well. So in terms of sample sizes, because we were testing different levels of basic income value, this led to slightly different sample sizes that were required. And again, like I said, we undertook an evaluability assessment to understand the statistical power that we would require to be able to detect impacts, and we want to be able to detect different impacts for males and females, and we want to be able to detect the community level impacts as well. So for the low level basic income, we understood that we require a sample size of just over 14,500 people. And the higher level, because it was a high level payment and the effects would be much clearer, would need a minimum size of 2,500 individuals. Next slide, please, Wendy. So looking at, sorry, we've gone back one. That's it. Yeah, sorry, just taking a little bit of time to come through in my computer. Great, thank you. So in terms of looking at those sample sizes that we specified, it was also important for us to consider the potential cost of a pilot in this regard. And so we were able to estimate what the direct costs of a basic income might be according to these sample sizes. We were able to calculate these costs minus projected costs on benefits and pensions due to some of these being replaced. However, these are all estimations, and we don't include the administrative and evaluation costs that would be involved in that as well. That was due to the complexities involved in the institutional feasibility as well, and being able to work this out particularly specifically. And these costs are outlined over a 3-year pilot period. So as you can see in the table there, for the two studies, which would be running consecutively at the same time, and we'd be looking at a total of just over 17,000 people, and that would be £186 million approximately cost for that. So that was really important in terms of the political and financial feasibility in terms of a pilot, and whether this would be valuable in terms of the learning that we could achieve from that. And as Wendy outlined as well, we were very keen to propose that a pilot should be undertaken, because we understand that the value from that to be worthwhile. So those are the kind of key pilot model design features that we were proposing as well. And I'm going to lead on to Wendy now, who's going to take you forward in terms of our feasibility assessment of this model, and some of the challenges that we came across when we did that as well. So I'll hand over to Wendy for now. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Barry. And like Barry said, we were alongside the process of designing or attempting to design a pilot that would meet the needs of all of the stakeholders around the table, including Scottish Government, looked after all of the participants of any potential study. We also had to consider a whole heap of other aspects that we sort of encapsulate in this framework. So we really were doing two strands of work alongside at the same time. So we were trying to design the model and also test the feasibility of that model as we went along. And clearly that was an iterative process between those two aspects of the work. But essentially what we did was we looked at both the political and the practical feasibility assessments. So we used a framework developed by Jürgen Dwasblary and colleagues to assess the political feasibility that would be required in order to progress to implementation. And we also looked at some of the more practical feasibility aspects. We've already spoken a little bit about financial and evaluability aspects, but I want to touch a little bit on some of the ethical aspects of a proposal of a design such as we did. So firstly, just in terms of that overall assessment of feasibility, clearly there's loads of detail in the final report. We wouldn't have time to go through all of the findings across all of those domains, but just to give a flavour of our overall assessment, essentially, whilst we concluded that a pilot in Scotland would be desirable and potentially possible, there are a number of feasibility challenges that make a pilot incredibly difficult in the current context. So essentially, they're very divergent political views across the Scottish and UK political spectrum that gives this a particular political flavour. And questions remain over the impacts within the Scottish context, specifically around labour market participation implementation issues. Public support varies, although whilst there's net support for the idea, it's worth exploring it more because there's not, the level of support varies really across different groups. Ultimately though, when we were looking at institutional and political feasibility, what we eventually understood was that there were substantive and very complex challenges around the legislative framework, some of the technical aspects of delivery associated with the institutional arrangements for a pilot, which would adequately test all principles of CBI. And that was really become very clear when we entered into discussions with colleagues in DWP and HMRC and relevant departments across Scottish and UK governments. Essentially, as we went through that process, we eventually began to have a much clearer understanding that within the current context, the Scottish Government or local authorities in Scotland alone could not implement a pilot of CBI. It really would.
I think Wendy's frozen for a minute. Hopefully it'll come back. Is that frozen for everybody? If so, Vary, could you come back in?
Hi, Mike. Give me 2 seconds and I should be able to
Thank
pick up
you.
from where Wendy left off. Okay. Okay, so I think maybe Wendy's logged off and logged back again. Okay, I can pick up from where she left off. So Wendy was just telling you about our overall assessment of feasibility, and we knew that the Scottish Government or local authorities in Scotland alone couldn't pilot a CBI as we described. Oh, is that Wendy back again?
Yes, apologies. I think I lost connection there. Very sorry. As long do I have to share screen? Apologies for that.
I was just about to pick up from slide 12, Wendy. So ethical considerations.
Yeah, I'm very sorry for that, folks. Are we okay to continue? You can see
we are.
Yep.
Okay,
thank you and apologies for that. Okay. So sorry. So what I was just saying was that we thought it was important to explore some of the ethical issues that would be associated with a pilot to ensure that there was no detriment to participants and to make sure that we were providing the most ethical pilot possible. So there were a number of governance and ethical issues that were raised through the development of the pilot recommendation. So we concluded that at any point in the future, when a pilot may go ahead, the issues would need to be explored in more detail and relevant risk management applied. However, just very briefly run through some of the considerations highlighted in the report. So we explored this ethical consideration of equipoise, and that's around consideration about whether or not it's ethical to provide an intervention that we know is beneficial to individuals to some people and withhold it from others. Given that we kind of understand that the provision of income at an adequate level is beneficial for individuals, that was where we had some queries around whether we were in equipoise or not. And in this case, we thought there was genuine uncertainty over the impact on some of the outcomes of interest, as well as being unclear about potential unintended consequences of providing income in this particular way. And whilst this is somewhat an academic discourse, I think it's important, and in this case the steering group concluded that a pilot probably would be ethical in this regard. We also discussed some of the issues in relation to ensuring that no individual or group participating in the intervention would experience detriment. And this includes assessing and mitigating potential negative differential impacts based on protected characteristics or socio-demographic status. We also discussed a number of possible ethical issues in relating to recruiting participants into a pilot. So, for example, could we insist on compulsory participation as we were committed to this principle of no detriment? We also wanted to ensure that no participant would be at financial or institutional detriment due to being in the pilot. So, for example, by merit of receiving a CBI and not other benefits, there may have been reduced or lost access to services or passported benefits, and we needed to be alert to that. Essentially, we recommended that a full integrated impact assessment would need to be carried out should a pilot go ahead in Scotland in the future. We also identified a range of good governance issues that would need to be assessed, and they're listed there. But top of that would be a research ethics committee application and some of the other aspects that would be required for good governance. Okay, so what does that mean for Scotland or the prospects of a pilot in Scotland? Ultimately, the challenges are substantial when looking at the legislative and regulatory landscape in relation to amending current social security and taxation arrangements. For example, we would not be able to vary tax rates for pilot participants as legislation prohibits geographical tax variations the way in terms of income tax. Thus, we couldn't pilot CBI alongside relevant taxation changes. And while it's been argued that that is a weakness in the pilot proposals and it would hamper any learning from findings, it was a very fixed barrier to our pilot proposals. Nonetheless, even without the taxation changes, the full collaboration of both DWP and HMRC would be required to fully understand and overcome the challenges. It would be a complex and time-consuming process to undertake the changes that would be required to both primary legislation and social security regulations. While some of those barriers may be overcome by reducing the scale or the scope of a pilot, but we concluded that may result in really the undertaking another pilot that doesn't test all of the fundamental principles of a basic income. And we kind of felt that that would be a real lost opportunity. And given the level of resource that would be required, we concluded that we didn't want to, I guess, dilute the pilot principles. So essentially, all of this would require substantial political will across not only local and Scottish governments, but also UK governments. We are hopeful that our feasibility findings can continue to contribute to wider discussions on Scottish society and a well-being economy. And indeed, as you'll see, that is the case. So what does this mean for other countries? There's lots that we've learned over the process, both from our work in going through this journey of trying to both design a pilot and assess the feasibility of it, but also with our discussions from colleagues across the world. We learned a lot. In fact, we learned a huge amount from previous and current pilots, both in terms of the published literature, but also from speaking with colleagues, particularly in Canada, Finland, and the Netherlands. And since then, we've learned more about our experience of exploring the feasibility within Scotland. So I guess for anyone else undertaking this sort of process or looking to set up a pilot, there's a number of things that we would urge attention to. The first thing is about political buy-in. It's absolutely crucial from day one and through every single step of planning, implementing and evaluating a pilot. I think that needs to be cross-party political. And even that, I think it's clear that that you need to pay so much attention through the entire process. We've seen from the position in Canada that even having early committee political buy-in can actually still cause problems down the road. As Barry mentioned earlier, I think you have to have a very clear rationale for the pilot. It has been argued that we have enough evidence already, but I think that many countries, or each country, has a unique political and institutional environment, and doing a pilot can provide crucial information about how to operate a basic income within that environment and ensuring no detriment for the folks that are participating. I also think you need to be incredibly clear about what you're piloting. I think there's a few characteristics of basic income unique, and particularly around unconditionality and universality, and those are also the aspects that are incredibly difficult to pilot, and it's all too easy to compromise on those aspects to make a pilot more feasible, but then that really restricts the learning from it. Framing and context is also crucial. I think you have to be very clear upfront about your outcomes of interest, and that helps to define how the pilot should develop. And in discussion with policymakers and others in Scotland, the starting point was poverty alleviation, although we were interested in a broad range of possible impacts. And other pilots across the globe have started from a different policy perspective. Finally, I think we cannot underestimate the power of communication and good comms. No matter where in the world a basic income pilot is proposed, there will be huge media interest and not only media but also public interest, and the communication with both community and the wider public and media needs to be very, very clear. And I can say from experience, no matter how clear you think you are and how good your comm strategy is, what you're doing will be reported at some point inaccurately in the press. The power of stories is very, very strong. Okay, so what's the current position in Scotland? So as Barry said earlier, the report was endorsed by all 4 local authorities involved and submitted to Scottish Government, and the report was publicly released in June last year. The report was then submitted to Scottish ministers. Our steering group of the feasibility study continues to meet on an occasional basis, mostly to discuss dissemination strategy and to share our findings locally, nationally and internationally, and take opportunities such as today. But in terms of the policy landscape and the potential future for a CBI, on the back of what's been happening in the last couple of years, we can't ignore the C word, which is COVID, just in case anyone's worried. There has been so much change in the last 18 months both in Scotland and across the globe. The Scottish Government have been incredibly keen to look at how Scotland recovers and continues to build on previous work, and they set up a social renewal advisory board in order to do that. That board considered the findings of the feasibility study, and in their report that was published at the beginning of this year, if not now, when they committed to exploring a minimum income guarantee now in Scotland. And in the SNP first 100 days document that was published, they committed to setting up a steering group on minimum income guarantee, which has now been constructed, and the first meeting of that steering group actually was yesterday, so it's a very timely discussion. It's co-chaired by Shona Robison, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Housing and Local Government, and that does have cross-party support on that group, or rather cross-party representation, and members of this steering group are represented on that minimum income guarantee steering group as well. And I think that probably gives a strong message about where Scottish Government are now in terms of where they think the future perhaps of social security in Scotland is. But I think that really is in response to some of the feasibility challenges that we've presented in our report. And I think it's probably, there's certainly a possibility that MIG could potentially become a stepping stone to basic income in the future, although I think it's early days with that one. As Vary said earlier, here are some of the links to the reports that we published through the work of the steering group. I understand these slides will be made available, but if not, I certainly have the links to some of these in my profile on Hoover. As always, I'm being a good member of the collaborative, and want to plug some of my colleagues' sessions later in the programme. So if you're interested in finding out different aspects or in more detail of the work of the steering group and some of the councils that sat on that steering group, there's 2 other sessions that are being held tomorrow, and the details are on the screen now. And I'm really pleased to say that we have both Andy and Corin on the panel today. So from the steering group, we have a number of our steering group members, including myself and Barry. We also have Julie, Paul, Corin and Andy, who have, I guess, different expertise across the steering group. We'd like to now open up for questions and discussion, and I think it's back to Mike to pose some questions. I will stop sharing now so that everyone can see the whole panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to Wendy and to Vary. There's been a lot of questions coming in to the chat through Hoover. It's interesting, we didn't go into great detail about the Scottish constitutional settlement and so on, so quite a few of the questions will be considered in that sort of context and such. Also, as you said, a number of the issues that are in the Q&A are actually going to be covering in much greater detail in other sessions. But I'll go through the questions on behalf of the participants. Start off with an easy one, perhaps. Would basic income be available to students?
I think I'll take that question. I mean, I think under the proposal that we created, essentially we would be choosing from a random sample of populations in Scotland. We didn't go too much into the evaluation methodology, but essentially we're proposing a clustered random sample. So really it would be the basic income under our proposal would be available for anyone that lived in that community. So we wouldn't be excluding any particular groups. And as we saw from the presentation earlier, there would be different payment levels for different age groups, but certainly I don't see why they wouldn't be available for students if we did manage to go forward with a pilot.
Right. Just say that from the very first slide, there was a number of organisations involved in the feasibility study group. Many of whom are represented here, and they bring a range of expertise and disciplines and so on. So they'll be sharing out the answers. One of them is, well, why test a low-level basic income? So the proposal was to have 2 levels. Why have a low level, which may not even meet the basic needs of people? And related to that, how does that particular low level relate to existing benefits?
Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody else wants to come in.
Andy had his hand up.
Okay, sorry, I can't see everyone, so Mike, you have to direct folks.
Okay, Andy.
Yeah, I think the gain that we get from testing a low level of CBI, which is set at basically what you would expect to get as a basic subsistence levels within the existing UK benefits system. The gain from testing that would be looking at the gain from an unconditional payment being made. So certainly, I think most people would accept that the subsistence rates set don't look at meeting a number of different needs, and that's why we also were suggesting that a higher rate would be looked at that was in line with a minimum income given an acceptable standard of living. So that would be the gain from testing at the level that we've set. So it allows us to look at the gains that may come from an unconditional payment being made.
Okay, so that's overcoming some of the aspects of the existing benefit system, stigmatization, failure to claim, etc.
Mike, maybe just to add as well, that I think we have to go from where we were starting as a group, which I think if we were going into the history of the actual study, there was quite a bit of debate about where do we actually set levels of basic income, and I think the lower one in particular was also sort of thought about from the fact that it would, in terms of the relationship it would have with the current benefit system, so that you could see the changes that you've just been, Andy and you've just been talking about. But equally, it gives us that sort of baseline from which to actually work and look at from an evaluation perspective. And then on top of that, look at the higher ones. So certainly, I think, you know, the way that we developed the ideas weren't just to say we will always have these two levels in terms of the actual evaluation. We were probably starting at a particular point, and over the study actually decided that actually the best way to do a pilot would be to have the two levels to see the differences that actually arose from those. So I think it's as much to do with our learning as well over that study period as much to do with where we got to at the final in the final report.
Thank you. Why did you propose payments will be weekly rather than monthly or yearly? There's another questions to come through. Who would like to take that?
I'm happy
Wendy?
to. I think that was one of those proposals that we thought would be, so I think we had looked at some of the evidence around the move to universal credit and monthly payments and some of the issues that had given rise to for claimants who were perhaps used to a more frequent income, and moving to monthly income was quite tricky. But it was one of those issues that we had hoped that in the future we could provide perhaps some flexibility over the frequency of payments. So it's not something that we were absolutely set on, that it must be a weekly payment, and that perhaps actually in the future people could opt into whether they wanted a monthly or a weekly payment, given that we are kind of now operating in the again back in the realms of idea rather than reality. These things, I guess, are all flexible, but that's really where we were coming from. I think that's fair to say.
Aye. And given the rationale in Scotland, particularly from the local authorities, was about alleviation of poverty, we do know there's very strong evidence that people who are on the breadline or below it really struggle to balance budgets. That's not their fault. It's because every penny is spent on necessities, and if you have a whole month's worth of money, it's difficult to stretch that out over the month, whereas weekly makes budgeting easier and therefore avoids people being forced into debt and as such. Question from colleagues in Canada, where there's almost universal consensus that the time for pilots is well gone. It's just kicking it into the wrong long grass. Why on earth are we going for yet another pilot or proposal for a pilot in Scotland when we've had them around the world? So who would like to? Julie would like to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And it's a fantastic question. I think in an ideal utopian world, moving towards a full-scale rollout, I know, is an idea that's endorsed by many. However, you know, we appreciate there's been many pilots throughout the world. Some of those not meeting, I guess, a true definition of a basic income, as Wendy and Barry have covered in the presentation. We spoke directly to people who had been involved in pilots in various places, and we've undertaken studies and assessments of what we can learn from the results of those pilots as well. But I think the fact still remains that, you know, those circumstances in relation to international pilots have been very different from the Scottish setup. You mentioned there the issue of the devolution of various responsibilities as well. So a very unique context in Scotland in that respect, and from a legislative and organisational or institutional perspective, but also from a socio-economic perspective as well in relation to the economic system and the way that our welfare state currently operates in addition to that. So I think for us, we thought there was merit in doing a pilot to learn more about how this would operate in the Scottish context, and also learn a bit more about the behavioural insights that we might get from a pilot, and a lot of that is set out in further detail in the report. But really, that was the key reason for our thinking about of a pilot. We don't have enough insights as to what the potential results would be from a Scottish context, and I guess an element of risk and moving to full-scale rollout without testing how this might operate. And as Wendy says, a key principle that we've had from the start and shared and endorsed as a group would be this thing about no detriment to any participants. So that is of importance to us as a steering group.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that? Any of the panel? No. Okay. Thank you. There's a whole series of questions around basically which are seated in the constitutional settlement, which people from Firth of Scotland will not know about. So it's basically, could Scotland introduce a basic income without the approval of the UK government? And maybe beyond that, do we think that will be forthcoming at any point? Paul, Vaughan first.
I'll maybe start and then folk can join in. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the answer Julie's just given. You could introduce a basic income pilot in Scotland, but not without understanding the impact on the tax and the benefits of the individuals that would actually receive it. So a payment could be made. There are powers within local government that we could do, and actually have been using those over the last 18 months of the pandemic in terms of making hardship payments to individuals. However, if to do this on a regular basis, I think the general view is you would have to really look at each individual option that was being presented to understand whether you could maintain a no detriment situation because of those tax and benefit impacts. And if folk do go and have a look at the benefits report and attend Andy's session tomorrow, plug that as well, then I think you'll soon understand the complexities that arise from that benefit system, and then equally for those who maybe aren't receiving benefits, what the tax implications become as well. So it's not to say that it can't be done. I think our role, though, as a steering group was to describe what was our view of the best route to actually test the basic income, and therefore came up with this particular proposal. As to whether there will be any wider agreement across different levels of government in the UK, there was a recent report from one of the parliamentary committees, the DWP committee at Westminster Parliament, which took evidence on basic income. I'm sure a number of myself, and there's probably a number of folk who are also attending this conference, gave evidence to that committee. The response from the committee was that I mean, of interest, but of a view that better targeting was probably required of benefit payments rather than going to the basic income movement. I think what's interesting, though, is that now that you have a Scottish government moving towards minimum income guarantee, Welsh government moving towards wanting to try the basic income pilot, who will have the same problems that we've described in our report, and also there's a number of the Northern Irish local authorities who are also now undertaking feasibility work alongside UBI labs across regions in England. I think there is a growing view about what can be done, and I think that pressure can all sort of build to actually making sure that there are changes that come, whatever those may be. But in terms of getting the current UK government to, I think, agree to undertaking a pilot of basic income, I think that's quite a challenge at the moment.
Andy, did you want to add to that?
I think just to agree with the first point that Paul made about being able to avoid detriment. I mean, the Scotland Act 1998 is the act that devolved powers from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament. And then the Scotland Act 2016 devolved a range of social security powers to the Scottish Parliament, which are mainly around disability benefits and carers benefits. So some low income benefits like funeral payments, for example. But the majority of responsibilities, certainly for working age benefits, remains at Westminster, and a basic income payment would have to interact with those and retain entitlement to those benefits. We'd mentioned, Vary mentioned in the presentation about additional support for people who have limited capability for work, for carers, for example. Now, it is the case that the 2016 Act has allowed some scope that wasn't there before in relation to the topping up of benefits or the creation of new benefits. Basically, there's 10 further exemptions from the reserve powers. One of them allows, exception 5 allows the topping up of existing UK benefits. Interestingly, though, that doesn't allow you to do anything really in relation to sanctions. So the Act would still keep the responsibility for conditionality with Westminster. And exception 10 of the 2016 Act does allow the Scottish Government to create new benefits. However, there's an explicit bar on creation of new pensions. And again, these would be benefits that would have to continue to interact with the UK government. So we're going to look at the issue of avoiding detriment, which we were really conscious of and keen that, you know, a lot of work went into this. It's setting out the risk to particularly those on low income. Then the conclusion would be that the current constitutional settlement wouldn't allow us to do that. But as Paul says, yeah, we could do something, but whether it would eventually mean that we could avoid detriment, clearly our recommendation is that isn't the case, and there's got to be really close working between both governments if even a pilot was going to be taken forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Julie, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Paul and Andy have given really extensive explanations as to our views on that. The only minor thing I would add is that you know, we did have good engagement with DWP and HMRC officials, and we're very grateful to all of their input, which was really helpful in developing the report. I guess a key barrier was the feedback that, you know, there might be legislative change required, and therefore that goes back to the points previously made that for legislative change there has to be extremely strong will to be able to, strong political will to be able to push something through Parliament. So just to add that aspect, but it is a topic of great interest.
Thanks very much. Just to say that there's some comments, people saying the chat's disabled or the Q&A. You need to go through Hoover to pose questions to the panel rather than through Zoom. Yeah, we all use abbreviations, acronyms, and presume other people. So for those who are out with Scotland and the UK, could somebody explain what DWP HMRC mean and what is their role in particular, please? Andy. Yeah. All
right, is it mine then? The DWP it's the Department of Work and Pensions, who's the kind of the agency that really is responsible for providing most of the benefits on behalf of the UK government. So, for example, universal credit. They currently provide disability benefits as well, although they're being devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And HMRC, they're responsible for child tax credits, for working tax credits, but they may also sort out your tax for you too. So hopefully that's a quick summary of their activity. But the DWP, HMRC, they are the agencies for providing the UK reserved benefits, and also to the HMRC in relation to tax policy, although there's some tax policy devolved to the Scottish Government too.
Thank you. Wendy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly. So one of the things that we learned through our discussions with both of those agencies is that it's not only that those are standalone agencies. I always thought of it as the agency that does social security and benefits, and the other one that looks at tax. But clearly, because of the working tax credits, etc., those kind of things, there are very complex interactions between those two agencies. So some of the barriers are not only sort of political and legislative barriers, but there's some very complex infrastructure barriers. So the information sharing systems between those two organisations would also need to be adjusted if we try to then overlay a basic income pilot on top of that. So it's a very complex picture. So I just wanted to add to that about the nature of the how those two agencies interact with one another.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to come back?
And just to say a plug for tomorrow, I'll kind of go through some of these things. Who has responsibility for what? When I finish the slide, I'm just doing. Thanks.
Yeah, I think wherever we looking at this in the world, complexity really comes through between different levels of government, different authorities and agencies of government, and so forth. So everywhere is complex, and we have particular issues within the UK, and it's not universal. The powers the Scottish Parliament has are much greater than the Welsh or the Northern Irish Assembly, which is greater than any of the English cities and so on. So they would struggle to put on pilots and experiments to a much greater extent, which is why the Scottish feasibility study was so very important within this national context, never mind internationally. So given those sort of constraints, limitations, one of the questions is effectively, will you be communicating to people during any pilot about what the limitations of a basic income pilot would be in Scotland? So the constraints that any pilot been undertaken in Scotland that it faced, how would you communicate that to the public? So that, I think Wendy finished up, that so that the media, negative commentators don't put out a false picture of what's been evaluated and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul, I think the short answer to that is at the moment there is absolutely no plans to undertake a pilot of CBI in Scotland. So I think in terms of developing communication strategies and media strategies or anything like that, that would need to be kind of constructed at the time. Paul, I don't know if you wanted to.
The only thing I was going to add to that is that in the main report, and we did a little bit about, I suppose the term that companies use these days is onboarding, but what it would be like to actually be selected for the pilot, what would have to happen as folk then came into the pilot, how you progressed through that, and then what the exit strategies were as folk left the pilot, and that probably picks up some of the views that Canadian delegates are expressing as well. So I think through that we'd have been quite clear to any participants, if there had been a pilot, that what it was going to be looking at. It was also touched on the type of qualitative evaluations that we were asking as well of those individuals. And as Wendy's sort of suppose hinted at, that there has been a lot of media interest. I think from as far away as Japan, all the way through to, you know, sort of the local media, and, you know, and any sort of looking at the UK papers and those who did, you know, try and report on this. You know, it did just split along political lines of those particular newspapers and their particular political views, rather than, you know, sort of a non-biased view of what we were attempting to achieve through the study. I think we probably got more balanced interest from foreign newspapers and foreign journalists than we necessarily got through UK.
Thank you. Okay, Corinne, yes.
And just to add that one of the things that we did in Fife in parallel with the CBI feasibility study was we did some citizen and stakeholder engagement with the RSA lab with people in Fife. And that was to look at the ideas around a civic basic income, and to look at the kind of support that would be needed before, during and after. And there is a report, we can share the link to that, which sets out some blueprints for, you know, if a pilot was to go ahead, there's a framework there for the kinds of things that would need to be considered to ensure that I think was successful and did fit with the local context.
Thank you. Again, I think what that underpins is the huge amount of work that went on in the feasibility study group and so forth. So with some questions about the pilots and, you know, will they be properly set up if there are pilots? How would they be evaluated and so on? And if I just flag up one of the sessions this afternoon is Dr. Marcia Gibson, who has done very extensive work and review of pilots around the world and so forth. So encourage everybody to go along to that. Yeah, a number of questions about this proposal for a minimum income guarantee advisory group being set up in Scotland. Some of the people from the feasibility study group are actually on that advisory group, and they may or may not want to respond. People asking basically, is that announcement in Scotland, is that a blow, or does it add to the momentum? And in particular, is it just another means tested benefit being proposed just for Scotland, with all that entails, including 100% withdrawal rate, and therefore it's not really a basic income at all? Who would like to pick up that hot potato? Wendy and Andy, yes.
My hand up with some trepidation. So at present, both myself and Andy and the chair of our feasibility steering group, Jerry McCartney, sit on the MIG steering group, or rather on the expert group from various things. I am actually a member of that steering group, not by merit of being part of the Basic Income Project, but by merit of my current post within COSLA, which is the Confederation of Scottish Local Authorities. And I think at the moment it's quite hard to say very much about that. The group only constituted and met for the first time yesterday. And that's at really the beginning of the process of setting up the work plan. I think what we should be really clear about is that they are not proposing a basic income or even a form of a basic income. We are looking at how could Scotland provide a minimum income floor for everyone that's living in Scotland through a combination of different income streams, be it from work or from benefits or other methods, including looking at sort of universal basic services. So it's I guess quite a different concept, and the way that it will be implemented and operationalised would be quite different from what we propose around a basic income. But it's very early days, and I'm not sure that we can say an awful lot more about it right now. Safe to say that there will be more information forthcoming from Scottish Government. Andy, I don't know if you want to add anything around that.
I think you've covered it. You know, the question about whether it's a blow or not. I mean, in relation to our steering group, we've never really been absolute advocates of basic income. Our job has been to test the feasibility of a pilot scheme. So I think it's for others to determine whether the change in policy or the development of policy is a blow in relation to the case for basic income. But I think given the early stages of where we are in relation to MIG, I think Wendy's summary is a good one.
Okay. Briefly, there's a whole series of other questions in the chat, which I think are probably too technical or specific for the panel. But on things like cryptocurrency, had we considered using that to fund in Scotland? There's a fictionalized account of how a UBI might work in, for instance, Southampton. Would that be useful to the feasibility study and to the pilot? And so forth. So on the one hand, I'd encourage people to go along. If you've got particular interest in any subject, really have a look at the programme as a whole and select the different sessions to go to. And we're just about coming to wrap up. So could I just put 3 questions together there? So have you looked elsewhere in the world to learn lessons and so forth? Secondly, sort of creative ideas from elsewhere. We've got a number of sessions, particularly early evening, around performance, art, poetry, using that to illustrate basic income. And did that inform yourselves on the study group? And how might the private sector be involved in any pilot? So it's quite disparate questions. And if you'd like to answer those and use it to pull together your thoughts, starting with Wendy. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll maybe take the first question and let other people have a little bit of time to think about the second and third questions. The first one is, did we look elsewhere? Yeah, absolutely. I hope that came through both in our presentation and the report. I think though, if people are particularly interested in how we use evidence from elsewhere, I would draw their attention to other pieces of work. So myself and Marcia Gibson, who is presenting later on the day, I'm not sure if she's in the session just now, did some work looking at basically doing a review of published evidence around other basic income type or like interventions that had been piloted elsewhere in the world. And I think that certainly provided a great basis for the work of the feasibility study in terms of what outcomes might be achieved through basic income in different places at different times and in different to different outcomes. The other thing we did was looking at sort of contemporary pilots that were going on, both in terms of the BN Congress that was held in Finland and also ongoing engagement with specific colleagues and specific pilots that were happening in Netherlands and Finland and Canada, and that's captured in the International Learning Report, and those findings are referred to throughout our entire final report. So yeah, absolutely, we wanted to learn from elsewhere, and I hope we managed to do that and use those lessons well to inform what we're doing in Scotland. And I can hand over to someone else for the other 2 questions.
Yeah, Julie, thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the third one there about private sector involvement. I think the involvement of a range of sectors to feed in and provide some constructive challenge to our report was really helpful. To enable that, we set up a stakeholder group, which was made up of think tanks, RSA, Child Poverty Action Group, GRF, Carnegie, a number of organisations who had an interest in community wealth building and an interest in broader well-being. So that was really helpful, and we used that group at critical junctures of drafting the report to test what we were proposing and how that might land as well, and that was really invaluable. And in addition, we also had a councillor group which included elected members from each of our local authorities, which fed into that group. Quite significant support across most parties on that councillor group. So the importance of us in testing these ideas throughout the process, being able to ensure they land in the right way, getting that buy-in that would support the findings of the report when they came out was all quite critical through the feasibility study process.
Okay, Wendy, and then Corin.
Yeah, just to kind of follow on from Julie there, I'm wondering if perhaps underneath that question is another question about external funding or private funding of a basic income pilot. And I guess, I mean, that is something that we looked at and considered, whether it would be from a sort of private benefactor or separately funded through Scottish Government, and is something we looked at. But the source of the funding for any potential pilot notwithstanding, it would still need to interact with the current benefit system and institutional context. So whilst we did explore that, I think fairly early on, we thought we would kind of put that to the side, because regardless of the funding structure, the other challenges still remained.
Thank you. And last word from Corin. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that second last question about the creative approaches, and I suppose part of this links in with that idea of psychological feasibility, that people can see what the benefits of a basic income are for them. So, we've been on a journey since sort of 2015-16 in terms of growing our own understanding and awareness of basic income and contributing to that conversation. So one of the things in the chat is around, a sort of fictionalized account that I think can you start to see things like basic income appearing in mainstream writing and other things. And I think certainly the last year has helped to help people to see the benefits themselves, whereas before they might have seen it as an abstract situation. In terms of creative methods, I think that they just bring ideas to life. So, for example, one of the things that I would have liked to have done, but we didn't do, was to engage the Children's Parliament in Scotland in terms of what children's views on a basic income would be. And I think that to capture some of that through video discussion and other things, I think would have been a really powerful way of helping getting across the basic concepts. Again, thinking back to the original journey, the RSA had put together an explainer video, and I think that was those kinds of engaging methods that helped to get across the concepts, and all part of growing the conversation. And it's great to have been a part of that in Scotland.
Very much. Thank you very much to everybody, to the panel, particularly Vary and Wendy, who did the first presentation, and all of you for taking part in the Q&A. One of the platforms we rejected for this Congress would have automatically cut us off at 12:05, which is quite strange. So it just counts you down and that's it, you all disappear. We decided to go with Whova and Zoom. One of the issues I think some people are having is an incompatibility with regard to the chat and so on. I think that's particularly on iPads, where you can't see everybody on the panel, for instance, and you weren't able to take part in some of the Q&A and some of the chat. I think that's beyond our technological skills, although Alan from Strathclyde, who's a helpful technician for today, may be able to advise us during the break. That's been a fantastic start. It's a helicopter view of what's been happening in Scotland, and inevitably it's opened up quite a few of the themes that we'll be addressing across the next 3 days. As I said, in particular, this afternoon, we have a number of sessions looking at those leaving care, carers, disabled, health, etc. And we also have the particular session on evaluation. And it's not just evaluating the Scottish pilots. If they come through, it's also learning lessons from elsewhere and so forth. So Again, we can't thank you in the normal way of applause and such, not buying you lunch, but if on your behalf of all the participants, if I could thank the panelists again, thank you for the Q&A, for those who put in questions. Apologies if we didn't pick up some, but they in particular will be addressed in all the different sessions. So the next session start at 12:30. You've got a quick chance for lunch. Please come along to one of those sessions, but over the day, over the next few days, make sure you do take breaks and so forth. We don't want to be watching screens non-stop. So thank you all very much again, and goodbye to everybody.